Welcome back to Future You. And Jeff, you already spoke up front about why this particular story was, of course, interesting to you. But I also want to highlight, I didn't see it coming during the conversation, but you said it in the middle of one of your questions to Walter, because I think it speaks to another one of the big, maybe implicit reasons that we keep coming back to M&A on this show, which is that the purpose of M&A is so that we have colleges that are stronger. Presumably that means, yes, financial strength, but also programmatically, value proposition wise, mission, results, and so forth. But just tell me why you made that point about the purpose of M&A being stronger colleges and universities.
Because, Michael, I think in higher ed, we see M&A as a negative thing, right? We see the disappearance of any institution, whether they're being merged or acquired, as a bad thing. Where I think, again, in the business world, M&A is seen as, potentially, on some sides, obviously consolidating power, but on other sides, making sure that two entities can go further faster and even survive in some cases because they have been merged. And I really do feel that for M&A activity to increase in higher ed, we're going to have to move beyond kind of the usual suspects we've seen to this day, just a handful of colleges and universities that have the resources. And we're going to have to go a little bit deeper in the bench. And what are they looking for and who are they? So I would look at institutions that are like a Gannon. They're big enough, but they're not large enough to really be going concerns on their own. And so they're going to look for those institutions, as Walter said, that maybe are around 1,000, 1,500, that could maybe add, 50% to their student body, 25 to 50% to their student body, could, which I think is really key here, add a new geographic region to the college or university. I think we have to remember that most college students, especially at the type of institution that a Gannon is, are coming from 75 miles away from home. So moving into a slightly different region is really not going to cannibalize your students. And then third is really that programmatic piece. What do other colleges, none of these colleges are really fully comprehensive in a way that a Northeastern might, or a Villanova might, or a big public flagship might, or a Boston University might, right? So again, and what are they gaining from potentially adding another college on in terms of programmatic? And, whether it's the arts, or whether it's computer science, or whether it's nursing or other healthcare programs, there's all these programmatic areas that I think these smaller colleges and universities want to go after, and they don't have the money or the resources to build it on their own. So why not just essentially merge or acquire another institution to do that?
Yeah, and Jeff, it speaks to something else, actually. We think a fair bit about also when a college closes, what it does to the surrounding community, right? Economically, vacating jobs and so forth. And I do think that there's some sort of inevitability, right, about this consolidation. If I'm the community, I want the college to have a chance, right? Like the infrastructure, some of it to have a chance at surviving. And so who knows what these mergers ultimately look like if they keep the branch campuses open and so forth down the line. But I will say, I think that's probably the only shot, right, at these communities sort of holding on to that higher ed institution, is if they're done with that context in mind. And there is some merger activity. I know some places probably take a cynical view of that. You merge and you sunset certain campuses. I don't think that's the way it'll be done in higher ed personally. And so I think also from the community perspective, M&A is an incredibly important topic towards strengthening the presence, right, of higher ed in these regions.
Yeah, and Michael, let me just jump in on that, because we talked when we were talking about my book a couple of episodes ago about the idea of the zombie mall, right, coming to colleges and universities. I noticed on social media a couple of people picked up on that, right? So is it better to have an institution that is kind of just limping along or no institution at all? So I feel like, in terms of M&A, we're going to have institutions that are at least going to be able to maybe keep these institutions to be going concerns above what they would have been otherwise. And so I get it. These are job centers. These are cultural centers. These are economic centers for many of these towns. But the chances of them surviving are getting slimmer by the day in some cases. The other thing that will happen is they become like just shadows of themselves. They are like these zombie malls, or maybe they are at least be able to preserve their biggest strengths if they were able to merge or be acquired by a bigger player.
Well, and that's where I want to go next, because strength of institution, which is that, when Gannon was going through its criteria for which institutions would be interesting, as merger partners, super clear on its objectives. Now, we could perhaps Monday morning quarterback and ask if getting an institution in Ohio that's going to have its own demographic declines, if that makes sense. But I do think the other point was critical, which is that the institution that they were looking at, Walter said, could not already be in financial problems from a cash flow perspective. And as you know, I'm working with someone on a piece that will hopefully publish later this year. So I don't want to talk about too much about it yet and jinx that. But it really centers on the importance of cash to an institution and net cash flow specifically. And I guess it occurs to me that for a smaller school like Gannon, as opposed to presumably something like a Northwestern or Villanova, or even an ASU, right, if they went on a spree, I would think financial health of the target school would be really, really important. And to that end, I thought it was interesting that if it had been less than 1,000 students, sort of a cutoff, right? It speaks to what we always talk about. You have it in your book, as well as something to keep an eye on, right, if parents are thinking about this stuff. But it also speaks a little bit to the arbitrariness, I guess, of like 1,000 students, like Ursuline just under 900, whatever. It just misses the cutoff. So it didn't hit into their filters. But then they were lucky that Ursuline was also being proactive at the same time. And it gets to something that I at least think a lot about, which is that data, obviously important, have a big role to play. But sometimes we forget that the categories, right, of data are created by people. We got to crawl underneath the hood, if you will, just to make that decision. And I guess I get a little nervous with these like big cutoffs, because maybe you miss that gem that is the perfect institutional partner. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah,
Like,
Michael, I think it's interesting that Ursuline, you also have to be among those gems of institutions willing to want to talk openly about their situations and want to be acquired. So I think some of this is around the data, but I think that these institutions, and this goes back to something that we've talked about before, is the boards of these institutions, the leaderships of these institutions need to be proactive much further in advance than they already are to say, you know what, we're not going to be able to keep this institution as a going concern. We're going to have to go out and find partners and be proactive. Because if it's all left to the Gannons of the world to filter out, who's in and who's out of potential partnerships, it's just going to be a chance about who they're going to find rather than those institutions that really need the help now.